Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today we're going to take a look at the worst metal albums from every year, from 1980 all the way to 2025. This is actually a topic I've wanted to do for a while here on the channel. Quest for Metal actually did a video similar to this recently on his channel. Definitely check that out, although you guys know him already. You don't need me to tell you how great his channel is, but I didn't see his video until I already compiled my list because I didn't want his choices to, influence mine. But great video, great channel. Definitely check that out here. And I'm going to start in 1980, so 45 years here. And of course, as always on the channel, it's all just opinion based, right? So if you're a fan of any of the albums I'm about to mention here, that's cool. That's awesome. More power to you. Hope you enjoy them. I'm glad you do. But for me, they just don't do anything for me for reasons that I'll get into in this video. Let's kick things off here in 1980 with I'm a Rebel by Accept. Not an awful album, but this is still Accept in their early stages, still trying to figure out, what they want it to be, and there's a heavy AC/DC influence on this album, which is cool, but just feel like they're trying too hard with it. The title track, I'm a Rebel, was actually written by Angus and Malcolm Young's brother, Alex Young, and handed down to the band, which is definitely the best song on here, and creatively, the band were a bit lost, but on the bright side, they had started to plant the seeds for the classic Accept sound that they would begin to realize on Breaker in 1981. And it's interesting for sure to see how Accept, evolved, but this album still feels pretty uninspired and a far cry from their classic work that would come just, a year later, starting with Breaker and that whole string of great albums in the 80s, all the way up to Eat the Heat, which, believe me, we'll get you in a little bit, but, this is not an Accept album I go back to all that often. 1981, Music from the Elder by Kiss. I've really tried with this record, I really have, and I know some people really love this album in retrospect, but there's no denying that this album was pivotal in, what killed Kiss in the early 80s. After going disco on Dynasty and alienating their fan base, releasing Unmasked, a little fanfare in America, losing Peter Criss as well, Kiss were running on fumes by this point, and I don't know who thought it was, the right time to make this super different experimental concept album, but that's exactly what they did, and the album is inconsistent, the story is hard to follow, and it was just a further departure from the classic Kiss sound, and tracks on here like Just a Boy, Under the Rose, Mr. Blackwell, they're just embarrassing, in my opinion, and downright cringeworthy. Ace Frehley barely plays on this album, but still manages to have the best song on the record with Dark Light, and he wouldn't appear on another Kiss record until Psycho Circus. Eric Carr makes his debut here as an official member of Kiss behind the kit, and even he, who was, a longtime Kiss fan before joining, was like, this is the kind of music we're doing, this is not what I signed up for, so, it makes sense that he would be confused as well, like everyone else was at the time, and I know some people will defend this album until they're blue in the face, and it's not without some good moments, like the aforementioned Dark Light. Also on here you have A World Without Heroes and The Oath, so there's some okay stuff, but for the most part it's Kiss hitting, very much pun intended, rock bottom here, and, a really disjointed record, once so bad that not even the Great Creatures of the Night from 1982 could save. Speaking of rock bottoms, from 1982, we have Zipper Catches Skin by Alice Cooper. Cooper was at his personal and professional worst at the time of Zipper Catches Skin, and we're in the midst here of his blackout era here, where Alice has no recollection of writing or recording this album, as well as Flush the Fashion, Special Forces, and Dada, which is goated, by the way, but this record sees Alice creatively burned out and completely erratic, deep into his alcohol and cocaine addiction that almost killed him, and the blackout period definitely does have some great ideas and hidden gem Alice Cooper tracks, but this album is full of bad ideas, and his band were also using at this time, and so there's really nobody there to tell Alice, like, these songs are not a good idea, So, it's full of material that I think should have been left on the cutting room floor or repurposed. Not a fan of tracks on here like, let's see, take your pick, really. I'm Alive, That Was the Day My Dead Pet Returned to Save My Life, I Like Girls, I Better Be Good, right? No More Baloney, Homo Sapiens, Zorro's Ascent. None of this is anything good here, and I recently gave this album a re-listen. I tried to get into it, and aside from I Am the Future and Adaptable, it's truly a mess of an album. Moving on to 1983 with Metal Magic by Pantera. Pantera's infamous debut album, or should I say Glamterra's debut. This, of course, is young Pantera here, trying to fit in with the times, pursuing a hair and glam metal look, fronted by Terry Glaze, and this era of the band definitely does have its merit, but it's not the Pantera that I like to listen to, nor is it anywhere near their best work. The production on here is pretty awful, produced by the Abbott brothers' father, and everything about this debut is low budget, all the way down to the album cover, and, it's a far cry from, what Pantera would become. But on the bright side, you could tell that even in his teenage years, Dimebag Darrell, or as he was performing under the name at this time, Diamond Darrell, was going to be something special on guitar. Same can be said for 1984's Projects in the Jungle, Pantera's sophomore record here, which is just a very cliche, by-the-numbers glam metal record, and you can definitely hear the influence of Joe Elliott on Terry Glaze's vocals. Pyromania had just come out a year earlier, and definitely had an effect on the band at this point, and, it's still not a great record, but the band had grown quite a bit, compared to their debut, at least proving that they had the staying power, and, probably the best thing about this era of Pantera is that we may have never gotten those classic 90s groove metal albums had the band not spent this time experimenting with their sound, figuring out what they wanted to be, and so for that, it's kind of cool to see the band, slowly morph into the Pantera we all know and love, and even here, you can already hear, a slight Van Halen and Judas Priest influence on Dimebag's playing, which is pretty neat. 1985 is going to go to Stay Hard by Raven, the band's debut on Atlantic Records, who, were definitely in the band's ear to go for a more hair and glam approach here, and it's just not the era of Raven that I enjoy listening to. I'm a much bigger fan of their, early new wave British heavy metal stuff, and I think, that, era is super underrated, but this period of the band, signed to Atlantic, is just really cheesy in my opinion. Not a fan of the band re-recording Hard Ride on here either. I prefer the original much more from the debut, and there are some okay songs on here, but the stylistic change that cemented their new hair metal sound, mixed with some really embarrassing lyrics, takes me out of it for sure. 1986, Look What the Cat Dragged In by Poison. I'm not a fan of Poison, but I cannot deny their impact on the 80s metal scene either, but I feel like a lot of their impact had a negative effect on metal throughout the late 80s. I mean, C.C. DeVille is a talented guitarist, but other than that, I've never really considered them to be a great band, and they, wrote some really simple songs with big hooks, and that could barely pass for metal at that time, but it took off. It was a big deal on MTV, and so you had a period where up until about 1990, where so many bands were trying to copy Poison, hoping for the same level of success, and you'll see that in some of my next few picks here, with bands going glam in an attempt to, capitalize on the success that some bands were having at the time, spearheaded by Poison. And I've just always found them to be very overrated, and it's an immensely successful and influential debut for sure, but I don't think this record has aged well at all, and I think it's safe to say, to go as far as to even say that this album ruined mainstream metal for a number of years. Like I was saying, with bands going glam, 1987 goes to Love Is for Suckers by Twisted Sister. Twisted Sister here making one last-ditch effort to revitalize their careers with Love Is for Suckers, which is an album that just does a complete 180 from the attitude and sound of the band. And although they were lumped in with, the hair metal scene of the 80s, Twisted Sister were significantly heavier than a lot of their hair band counterparts, but their success peaked on Stay Hungry, Come Out and Play did not enjoy the same level of success, and the band were very close to breaking up here. I believe this was initially supposed to be a Dee Snider solo record, and Dee's ego was out of control here. Apparently, Adam Mendoza wanted to kill him. Nobody was communicating with each other properly, and it really shows on this album here. A really lifeless, uncharacteristic sellout album by Twisted Sister, and it's a far cry from the rest of their catalog. Same can be said as well for 1988's Cold Lake by Celtic Frost. You have some albums that are still debated to this day, whether or not they were sellouts, and then there are others that, you can pinpoint from a mile away, like Cold Lake. An absolutely inexplicable decision by the extreme metal legends, following up the classic Into the Pandemonium with a glam metal album that felt completely out of left field and was a poor fit for the band. It doesn't work. Tom G. Warrior sounds completely out of place here pursuing this type of sound, and it's just an egregious sellout album. It's probably as bad of a sellout as you can possibly make. Tom is embarrassed by it. He considers it to be the worst album ever created in heavy music, and I don't know if I would go that far, but it's up there for sure. Ditto all of that for 1989's Eat the Heat by Accept, one of my most hated records of all time, and this video so far is making it seem like I hate hair metal, which is not the case at all, but this era of metal saw so many bands changing to adapt to a more MTV accessible image and sound, and it worked for, some bands like Poison a lot better than others, than, say a band like Celtic Frost, Twisted Sister, Judas Priest, Discharge, and more, including Accept, and, I've been ranting on this album since I started the channel, so I'll keep it brief here. Accept should never go glam. David Reese was a terrible choice to replace Udo Dirkschneider on lead vocals, and this record should be incinerated. Moving into the 90s here with 1990, gonna go with 10 by Y&T, the band's final album before their first disbandment, and you had a lot of lineup changes in this time period for the band, right? Joey Alves had left the band in 1989, was replaced on rhythm guitar by Steph Burns, and many of drummer Jimmy DeGrasso's original tracks were redone on here by Steve Smith, formerly of Journey, and so lots of personnel turnover here, which I think really hurt the band by 1990, and this record also suffered from poor timing. It was do or die for a lot of these hair bands by 1990 with, grunge and alternative on the up and up. And of course, a year later, there'd be another album called 10 that would be significantly more successful. But, they definitely tried here for a more arena rock, poppy approach, and it just doesn't work in my opinion. That said, Hard Times and Lucy are two killer tracks from this album worth checking out for sure, but the band would not make another record for 5 years, and honestly, I think that was for the best. To take some time, figure out, what you want to be, weather the storm of the changing music scene, and come back revitalized. And for what it's worth, I think Endangered Species and Musically Incorrect did just that and are some of the band's best work. 1991 goes to Pink Bubbles Go Ape by Helloween. Helloween should have just stuck with, what worked for them following up the Two Keeper, the Seven Keys albums, but instead the band took a less serious approach to their songwriting, feeling burned out and with a real lack of inspiration here. No Kai Hansen on this album doesn't help either, and the band just did not put their best foot forward here. It definitely has its moments, but there are some tracks on here that are just downright embarrassing. Songs like Heavy Metal Hamsters, Someone's Crying, I'm Doing Fine Crazy Man, Going Home, and more. Just not great Helloween in my opinion, and a real step down from the Two Keeper albums that preceded it. For 1992, I had a really hard time because this was a stellar year, not too many stinkers in 92, but if I had to pick one, I guess it has to be the Cuts EP by LA Guns, a band who were already struggling to stay afloat amid, the grunge takeover of the early 90s, and this EP did not do too much to help them. This was made in response to a rumor that the band were splitting up at the time, so they made cuts just kind of to hold people over until their next album, but the problem here is that it feels like a very low-effort EP, comprised mostly of uninspired covers of The Damned, David Bowie, the Ramones, and more, and nothing special on those covers at all, and really nothing that made them stand out from the original, nor do the band take any chances here in trying to, make them their own. You have Steve Riley drumming on 3 tracks here on his way out of the band by this time. There's a handful of original tracks on here too that are, alright, but nothing really memorable either. 1993, we have Chameleon by Helloween, once again here on the list, and, I give Helloween a lot of credit for trying something different on Chameleon, especially coming off the lazy Pink Bubbles Go Ape album, but this is a little bit too different, The band opted for a 70s rock and jazz-inspired approach here that just did not work at all, and typically I like it when bands challenge their audience with something new and out of their comfort zone, but this record never clicked with me. It feels less like a genuine experimental album here and more like a lost band just throwing wild ideas at the wall just to see what would stick here, and none of it stuck. Long story short, Michael Kiske and drummer Ingo Swischenberg would depart the band soon after, and Kiske would not return to Helloween until the Pumpkins United reunion in 2017, so not a great album here and a really weak one for Kiske to go out on. 1994, another excellent year for metal, but I gotta go with Get What You Deserve by Sodom, one of my least favorite Sodom records. The band continued to experiment on this album, but this time pursued, a more crossover thrash approach, and not a fan at all of Sodom doing the crossover thing. Kind of wish the band would have continued down the road of, tapping the vein, retaining the death metal elements on display on that record instead, but, crossover can be pretty hit or miss for me, and this instance it just doesn't click, and I'm not a fan of, the punky vibe on some of these tracks at all. 1995. So I was torn on 1995 between Forbidden by Black Sabbath and Octagon by Bathory, so I turned to you guys to help me out. I put out a poll asking which album you think is worst, and you guys said Bathory and Octagon, so I think I have to agree with you guys here. I've definitely gained a newfound appreciation for some of Forbidden with the release of the new 2024 mix, and what's interesting though about both of these albums is that they really suffered from, poor production choices. Not really sure what Quorthon was thinking with this record. I mean, musically it continues a thrashy sound on Requiem, but this album feels super unfocused with a major lack of memorable tracks or, memorable moments at all. And the best thing on here is the cover of Deuce by Kiss, and when the best song on your album is a cover, it's usually not a good sign. The lyrics on here are super weak, especially coming from the same guy who gave us Hammerhard and Under the Sign of the Black Mark, and probably most importantly, back to the production, this record is just a headache to listen to. Classic Bathory records have a rawness elements to them that add to the atmosphere of the record, but this time it takes away from the album, which feels sloppy, right, with really thin drums that are turned up way too loud in the mix as well. 1996 is going to go to Slang by Def Leppard. I'm not a huge Def Leppard fan to begin with. I love their early stuff, when they were a new wave of British heavy metal band, and everything after Pyromania is pretty hit or miss for me. I even have a pretty love-hate relationship with that record, but I definitely am not a fan of the band going for a more grunge and alternative sound in the mid-90s. It's like that polar bear in Arlington meme, where it just, shouldn't be there, right? Especially by 96, 2 years after grunge had peaked, and by this point, you had even the pillars of grunge, moving on, evolving their sound into something more, right? With Pearl Jam experimenting a lot on No Code, and Soundgarden was down on the upside, Nirvana were done, and Dave Grohl had moved on to the Foo Fighters, so those bands had already started to move on, and yet here's Def Leppard delving into, some more grungy territory. It just doesn't work. 1997 goes to Generation Swine by Motley Crue. This record was a nightmare waiting to happen, following up their only album with John Corabi, self-titled, from 1994. The band and the label were frustrated that it didn't perform better, and, the band fired a bunch of people around them in their circle, including Corabi, who was replaced by a returning Vince Neil out of pressure from the label, and I think the reunion with Vince at this time was a bit ill-advised. I don't love the self-titled album, but I think with, a few more albums, they could have really built up a cool chemistry with Corabi, and that one album already stood out, compared to their other stuff, and I think Generation Swine was a massive regression for the band, who sounded much more focused on self-titled, whereas this record is just a free-for-all of the band's worst tendencies. The alternative metal hint of industrial sound feels clunky and inauthentic as well, and they re-recorded Shout at the Devil, which was dumb, obviously not as good as the original track. On here, Afraid, I would say, is the only song that I really enjoy and go back to. The rest of this record just blurs together like one midlife crisis after another. For 1998, I'm going to go with the least successful Human Cannonball by Destruction, the third and final Neo-Destruction album, and the final Destruction record with Thomas Rosenmerkel on lead vocals, who incoherently screeches his way through this entire album, belting out some of the band's weakest lyrics, but who would have guessed that an album called The Least Successful Human Cannonball would have some poor lyricism, right? But, the production on this record is also really poor as well. It's super muddled, produced by Thomas Schnitzler, and there are some decent riffs on here at least, but it's all over the place, and, it sounds so unfocused, and it's no wonder that, the band don't even consider these records to be a part of their catalog anymore. 1999's worst belongs to Risk by Megadeth. Sometimes risks just don't pay off, and that is the moral of this album, or at least it was once Dave Mustaine finally came to his senses, and it must have all hit him at once when he puked after the making of the Crush a music video, but, this is just Dave trying to write a radio hit over and over, and failing time and time again, and the band had been moving in a more commercial direction for sure for a while, but this album, it barely thrashes at all. It's very uncharacteristic of Megadeth, all of the hallmarks of the classic Megadeth sound that made albums like, Peace Sells and Rust in Peace and, So Far So Good So What, even up to Euthanasia, which was a little bit more commercial but still a great album, and Countdown to Extinction. All those elements that were there that made those albums great are missing. Dave is trying way too hard on this record, and it shows. Entering the 21st century here for 2000, let's go with New Tattoo by Motley Crue. This album might honestly be worse than Generation Swine, if I'm being honest, and if anything, it proved that Motley Crue had not matured as a band whatsoever from a songwriting perspective. I mean, when you write a record like this in your 20s, like Motley Crue did back in the 80s, it's a lot different from writing a sleazy shock rock record in your 40s. The band had reverted back to old lyrical themes that, for a band who'd been around for nearly 2 decades at this point, it should have been, juvenile and primitive, but this also sees the band, at one of their most tumultuous periods. Randy Castillo on drums here for this album, after Tommy Lee had left the band to start Methods of Mayhem, LOL, and, Mick Mars also claims to have barely played on this record, saying he only played like one lick on the whole album, so he definitely was not locked in here either, and the whole thing is just one steaming pile of garbage. New decade, new tattoo, same old Crew. Next, 2001 here, let's go with Demolition by Judas Priest, the second and final Priest album with Tim Ripper Owens on lead vocals, and Ripper's a great vocalist, and he does his best on Jugulator and Demolition, but he was never going to be able to fill Rob Halford's shoes, and while Jugulator is significantly heavier, that seems to pick up where Painkiller left off, Demolition features much weaker songwriting, in my opinion, written mostly by Glenn Tipton, and this album, as a result, feels feels a lot more like a Tipton solo record than anything else. Clocking in at 70 minutes, it's way too long and full of filler on here. Despite a few standouts like Machine Man, Hell is Home, Bloodsuckers, and Lost and Found, there are, a lot of really weak tracks on here that, could have definitely been trimmed down significantly to make this record shorter, at least under an hour, but for me, it's not one of my favorite Priest albums, and even though I like Ripper, not a big fan of those two albums he did with Judas Priest, especially Demolition, which I think is a major step down even from Jugulator. 2002, Abigail, Part 2, The Revenge, and, sometimes it's just best to leave the original albums alone. The sequel is never as good, and King Diamond, who was never at a loss for a cool concept, should have just kept the Abigail story confined to one album. Abigail 2 is not his best concept, and none of the tracks on here live up to the original, which is just an untouchable classic, and I'd much rather the King had tried to write a new concept than add to Abigail and attempt to increase album sales, and I think it's safe to say that anyone who might have been drawn back into King Diamond by this record with the idea that, well, it's going to be just as good as the first Abigail album, were quickly disappointed. 2003, Saint Anger by Metallica, and, I don't hate Saint Anger. I really don't. I enjoy tracks on here like Frantic, the title track, Some Kind of Monster, Dirty Window, Invisible Kid, right? Love what they did with All Within My Hands, with the acoustic shows, and the Symphony of Metallica 2. But, even, with the songs that I enjoy on this record, it's the elephant in the room for 2003. You can't ignore Saint Anger when it comes to the worst records of 03. Even though I enjoy some of these tracks, and I think they're much better live with guitar solos, you still cannot ignore the problems on this record. There's no guitar solos, Lars' snare, Jason Newsted's departure, Bob Rock on bass, sloppy production, tracks that go on too long, James destroyed vocals, ill-advised new metal experimentation, and the whole Some Kind of Monster doc. But that being said, I really do enjoy this album. 2004, Soundtrack to Your Escape by In Flames. This is often criticized as the point where In Flames fully abandons the balance between melody and aggression that defined their earlier work, opting instead for a slick, over-processed sound that feels sterile and emotionally flat. And the riffs on here are repetitive, they're simplified, and the songwriting leans heavily on mid-tempo chugging, and the heavy use of effects and studio polish really drains the music of any real bite. Right, so not a fan of that whatsoever. Some of the choices they made in the studio here were just, the wrong ones, in my opinion. Anders Friedman's vocals are buried under layers of distortion, and the whole thing feels calculated rather than inspired, and what's sad is that it's still a far cry from some of the band's worst stuff. 2005, Unleash the Fury by Yngwie Malmsteen's Rising Force. This exemplifies Yngwie at his most self-indulgent, still offering great technical proficiency, but with little regard for songwriting or cohesion. Nearly every track follows the same formula. You've got lightning-fast neoclassical runs, awkward vocal lines, and just endless solos that blur together into one shapeless mass of notes, and the vocals are widely regarded as some of the weakest in his catalog, and the songs feel like, mere backdrops for the shredding rather than, fully realized compositions, and so instead of sounding powerful or inspired, the album just feels exhausting, as if, the idea of, virtuosity had completely replaced creativity by this point. 2006, Revolutions Per Minute by Skid Row. Frequently derided for being Skid Row's worst record here, stripping down the band of nearly everything that once made them compelling, replacing that gritty hard rock identity with a generic trend-chasing modern metal sound. The riffs on here feel super uninspired, the production is flat and lifeless, and the songwriting lacks any memorable hooks or emotional weight to them. Johnny Salinger's vocals are, serviceable. He does a fine job, but they fail to bring either the charisma or intensity that was needed to, elevate these songs and make them feel, anything more than, disposable, in my opinion. And rather than sounding like a reinvention, Revolutions Per Minute comes across as a band struggling to stay relevant, really without a clear path or sense of who they were or who they wanted to be anymore. Next up, 2007, gonna go with Humanity, Hour 1 by the Scorpions. This is a one-song album for me. I think the title track is a great song, memorable lyrics, great chorus, but the problem is that's all there is that stands out on this record, which is otherwise a very unmemorable Scorpions album that lacked the urgency and the excitement of their earlier classic works, and Humanity is a great track, but you have to sit through 45 minutes of a boring concept album first, and this may come as a shock to some people, but when I want to hear a concept album about an apocalyptic civil war, the Scorpions are not the first band I turn to. 2008, Nostradamus by Judas Priest. On paper, this seems like a really cool idea. A double LP concept album by Priest, still riding high with the reunion with Rob Halford and their comeback album Angel of Retribution from '05. But in execution, this record proved to be anything but cool. The album is 2 hours long, and with the exception of tracks like Death and Nostradamus, literally nothing happens on this whole thing. Nothing else on here is interesting or memorable at all, and in fact, most of the material here blends together. The concept feels dragged out, and it's not interesting after a while. I'd say had the band trimmed this down a bit to a single record, it still wouldn't have been great, but it would have been a much easier listen for sure. 2009, let's go with American Soldier by Queensryche. By this time period, you have Jeff Tate calling all the shots here as the band's main thematic leader. He'd taken over, was making all the decisions, and he was really the Roger Waters to Queensryche's, Pink Floyd, but this is no Dark Side of the Moon. Musically, the band strips away much of the progressive nuance that once defined Queensryche, replacing it with, safe, mid-tempo hard rock tracks that, barely take any risks, and the songs blur together, the hooks are forgettable, and lyrically, despite the album being inspired by Jeff Tate's brother serving in the military, the whole patriotic metal thing had been done before and done, so much better in the past. 2010, Hellbilly Deluxe 2 by Rob Zombie, and just like with Abigail Part 2, Hellbilly Deluxe 2 is another sequel that cannot live up to the original. This is not one of Rob Zombie's most interesting or engaging albums, and nowhere near the level of the original Hellbilly Deluxe. I feel like the riffs on here are simplistic, the beats feel mechanical, and the songs are reliant on, heavy, recycled horror samples and cliches that just feel played out by 2010, and rather than sounding energetic or menacing, the album comes across as lazy and formulaic, as if, Rob Zombie is just going through the motions here, slap Hellbilly Deluxe on it, hope it sells, people thinking it's going to be 1998 all over again. Well, newsflash, it was not. 2011, this was real easy. Illid Divinum Insanus by Morbid Angel. Infamous for abandoning Morbid Angel's death metal legacy in favor of industrial and electronic elements that clash really badly with the band's strengths. The program beats on here, the awkward song structures, and the sterile production strip away the chaos and the menace that fans expect from classic Morbid Angel, and it leaves behind tracks that feel disjointed and confusing, and this was a really disappointing reunion album with David Vincent as well, and the lack of Pete Sandoval on guitar certainly didn't help matters at all, and instead of sounding experimental or forward-thinking, this album feels like, a failed identity crisis, and it really alienated longtime listeners as well, without offering a compelling new direction either. 2012, Kings and Thieves by Jeff Tate. By 2012, Jeff Tate was dealing with a serious identity crisis. Kings and Thieves sounds less like a confident solo statement and more like a diluted version of late-era Queensryche, and the songwriting here is uneven. It relies a lot on generic hard rock riffs and uninspired choruses that rarely stick, and, despite Jeff Tate's still capable vocals here, the album lacks strong melodies or memorable moments, making it feel bloated and directionless at times rather than the bold reinvention that I think he had hoped for in the midst of, Queensryche's nasty breakup. And it's wild. The same guy who, has the brains behind Operation Mindcrime concept also could write such lame stuff. 2013, Super Collider by Megadeth. I guess those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, and Megadeth going for a more radio-friendly approach didn't work for them back in the late 90s, and it failed once again here on Super Collider. The riffs are tame, the tempos are restrained, and the songs prioritize bland choruses over any kind of intensity or technical bite. Dave Mustaine's snarling vocals are ill-suited to the glossy production of this record here, and the album ultimately feels like a compromised effort that, pleased neither longtime fans or mainstream rock audiences, so kind of a double failure there. 2014, let's go with Hydra by Within Temptation. This album jumps awkwardly between symphonic metal, pop, electronic rock as well, resulting in a really disjointed listening experience with very little cohesion throughout, and it's super polished sounding, with the songwriting sacrifices the dramatic weight that once defined the band's sound here, and it's definitely overproduced. I'm not a huge fan of all the excessive guest appearances and genre hopping throughout either, and it's a polarizing record for sure. Some people love this album, some people don't. I could never take to it personally. One of my least favorite albums from Within Temptation, and definitely one of the worst symphonic metal albums from a major symphonic metal band, in my opinion. So for 2014, gotta go with Hydra. 2015, Got Your Six by Five Finger Death Punch. I just don't know how people listen to Five Finger Death Punch. It's some of the most eye-rolling butt rock I have ever heard in my life, and this record feels like someone doing an impression of Five Finger Death Punch, from the juvenile lyricism to the same recycled chugging riffs and predictable breakdowns, and I'm not a fan of Ivan Moody's vocals either. The end result here feels stagnant and repetitive, reinforcing the band's worst stereotypes rather than doing anything to evolve their sound. 2016 goes to Dream Theater and the astonishing and overlong and self-indulgent rock opera whose ambition far outweighs its execution, in my opinion. Spanning over 2 hours long, this album is bogged down by endless exposition, forgettable melodies, and a really convoluted story that really only Rush could make sound cool, is what I've said on the channel in the past about the concept of that album, but the story distracts from the music rather than enhancing it, in my opinion, which is a big problem on a concept album. And despite moments of technical brilliance, you can't take away the fact that John Petrucci is an incredible guitarist. I could listen to him solo all day, and the band are one of the most technically proficient bands in the world. There's just sheer bloating on here and lack of memorability that make the whole thing feel exhausting, and it's as if complexity and scale were prioritized over the songwriting on here. And I love Dream Theater. I do like the Mangini era a lot, and the band were definitely trying to prove they could still write this big epic concept album without Mike Portnoy, but this record just for 2 hours goes absolutely nowhere. 2017 goes to Coming Home by Falling in Reverse. I was wondering when Emo Spinal Tap were going to appear on this list. Coming Home by Falling in Reverse is a record that I've only heard once and have no desire to go back to ever listen to it again, much like everything else from the 40-year-old edgelord Ronnie Radke. Some people put him on this pedestal as this great songwriter and a genre-hopping genius, and I just don't get it. Nothing this guy does feels genuine. It's a poor attempt at writing angsty music, and there's minimal intensity here and watered-down hooks. And now, am I a little biased because I can't stand Falling in Reverse? Probably, but then again, there's nothing on here that makes me want to like them either. 2018, Re-Idolized, the soundtrack to The Crimson Idol by Wasp. So this one was really easy. Just a quick Google search, when did Re-Idolized come out? Oh, 2018, that's my pick for 2018. Real easy. If you follow the channel, you know that, probably know by now, I hope, that The Crimson Idol by Wasp is my favorite album of all time. The original 1992 record is an absolute masterpiece, a scathing concept piece that I would put on par with The Wall, or really any other celebrated concept album that gets the credit that the Crimson Idol never did. And then, for some reason, in 2018, Blackie and the current Wasp line decided that they were going to re-record the whole record. Why? If it's not broken, don't try and fix it. And that's what they tried to do here. And the end result, in my opinion at least, is a weaker, tamer, overthought, and overproduced version. Blackie removed all the vulgarity from the record, which takes a lot of the bite out of some of the lyrics on here. There's no Frankie Banali or Bob Kulick, who, together with Blackie Lawless, really caught lightning in a bottle on the original Crimson Idol here at a time when Blackie was just trying to keep the band together. The production has nothing raw about it at all, and the whole thing feels far too polished and sanitized. The only cool thing about this project is the addition of some new tracks that, kind of fill in some gaps in the story, but those could have been released as bonus tracks, sometime else down the line, and definitely don't constitute a reason to re-record the whole record. Bottom line, why touch an already perfect album? I don't want to hear AC/DC go back in the studio and remake Back in Black. I don't want to hear Iron Maiden go back and remake Power Slave. There are just some albums that you should leave alone, and I'm not a fan of bands doing that with classic albums and going back in and re-recording them. Didn't like Exodus doing it with Bonded by Blood. Not a fan of Twisted Sister doing it with Stay Hungry either. At the end of the day, just leave classic albums alone. 2019, I the Mask by In Flames. Another step down in In Flames' long slide away from creativity, recycling the same watered-down alternative metal formula they'd already been leaning on for years at this point. The riffs are mechanical, the choruses feel, focus-tested for radio play, and the songwriting really lacks any real tension or payoff. The production on here is slick and professional, and it only highlights, though, how safe and uninspired the material is, and needless to say, we're a long ways away from the Jester Race by this point. 2020 now, let's go with CMFT by Corey Taylor, and it's a shame, because I was so looking forward to this album at the time. It was Corey's solo debut. I was expecting something heavy but different from Slipknot, and listen, I'd even have settled for, something equal to Stone Sour, even though I think their best work is on those first couple of albums, but in execution, this is just a bland, forgettable album that jumps awkwardly between hard rock, punk, and hip-hop pop without mastering any of them, resulting in a disjointed mess of half-formed ideas. 2021 Still Sucks by Limp Bizkit. Well, at least they're self-aware. 2022, let's see Five Finger Death Punch and what they're up to here. Afterlife, coming out here in 2022, continues Five Finger Death Punch streak of creative stagnation, reusing the same aggressive but safe formula that they'd used with almost no variation over their last few records. The lyrics on here are like they were written by a 5-year-old, delivered without nuance or growth at all, and musically, the riffs and rhythms and choruses are so familiar they blur together, making the album feel like just, checking off Five Finger Death Punch tropes one after the other than a genuine artistic effort. But it can be a double-edged sword, because I could say the exact opposite about my pick for 2023, and that's Life is But a Dream by Avenged Sevenfold. It's polarizing for its own sake, leaning so hard into experimental ambition that it forgets to be engaging. The album's scattered genre shifts, abstract songwriting, and indulgent structures feel more like an art project than a cohesive listening experience, and while technically impressive, the lack of memorable songs and emotional connection makes the record feel pretty cold and pretentious, prioritizing the concept over substance here, and it feels like it's just experimental for the sake of being experimental and as avant-garde as possible. And while I really enjoyed the exploration on this album at first, I soured on it pretty quickly once kind of the shock of the band's artsy approach shook off. 2024, Popular Monster by Falling in Reverse. One of the biggest mockeries of metalcore and everything that goes into it, all the way down to the embarrassing cover of Papa Roach and Last Resort here, and at the 40-year-old edgelord Ronnie Radke, whose lyrics hit an all-time low here. And listen, if you're able to get past the first few lines of the album opener prequel, you have incredible willpower. The whole thing feels like a parody, but then the haunting realization sets in that it's not a parody. He's being totally serious, and musically this album is just noise. It leans heavily into, glossy electronics and forced genre mashups that just don't work. And, then Falling in Reverse fans get mad at me when I call them a metal band. They say, well, they're not metal, and I say, yeah, you said it. Instead of sounding, bold or innovative, it comes across as exhausting and insincere, and if it is sincere, then my God, someone needs to take the pen away from Ronald McDonald as soon as possible. And last but not least here, we have 2025. You guys saw the video I did of the worst albums of the last year. Then this is probably no surprise, but I've got to go with Extinction Level Event by Dark Angel. This album is an enormous letdown, especially when you consider how long it took to finally arrive. After a 34-year wait, expectations were, understandably high for this record, not just for newer listeners like myself, but for longtime fans who've been anticipating this comeback for decades, and the end result simply does not justify that patience at all. The record feels oddly flat and lifeless, as if it was, rushed or assembled without much conviction, with production that comes across as really cheap rather than punishing or raw like their earlier stuff, which was also, on a lower budget, but it was different, bands back then weren't recording with a ton of money to put into their production value and stuff like that, and so there are ways to capture the rawness of the old sound while also sounding a bit more modern and sleek, and this record just strikes out on both accounts. The guitar work here is surprisingly unremarkable, lacking the ferocity and complexity or memorability that, once defined the band, and there's a glaring absence of riffs or hooks that stick with you after the album ends. Nothing here feels dangerous or urgent or inspired. It just sort of exists, and it's hard not to shake the thought, especially while listening, that Gene Hoglan walked away from Testament for this, and it's a release that feels a lot more like a missed opportunity than a triumphant return that it should have been. So hopefully the band are able to, find that old spark once again. If they're going to keep making albums now that they're back, and if they do, definitely have low expectations going into their next release, but I hope they're able to find it once again, because we all like Dark Angel, and I think it sucked for a lot of us to have to rank it so high on our list of the worst records of the year last year, so hopefully they're able to turn it around. Well, we made it. 45 years of negativity from 1980 to 2025, talking about the worst albums in metal from each year. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my choices, and what are some of your least favorite years in metal and your least favorite albums from those years. I want to hear from you. Until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.